Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the CODEX Symposium. I hope everyone had a good first day at the fair. I'm sorry we hit a patch of cold weather, especially for California. That's not usually the case. Oftentimes we get to welcome you into a little bit warmer climate, and it's a little reprieve from other places. But thanks for your patience yesterday in our new venue. We are very excited about that space, but it's still being renovated, obviously. So come talk to us if you have anything you'd like to have our attention with. I want to acknowledge Peter Koch and Susan Filter sitting here up in the front as the founders of the Codex Foundation. Please visit them at their table. I'm sure they miss being up here and talking with you from this perspective, so please visit them. And thank you. On behalf of the Board of Directors and myself, welcome to Berkeley. To all of you who have come from near and far to share the work you do as artists, craftspeople, scholars, librarians, curators, and individuals with a passion for the book as a work of art. I would also like to thank the generous sponsors of this event, which hopefully you saw on the slide presentation. We deeply appreciate your enthusiasm for the field of book arts and your belief in us as an organization that can significantly help to contribute to the field. So thank you if you're out here today. Yeah. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge our first year sponsoring the 2 Emerging Artists tables. The Emerging Artist Fellowship recipients receive a free table at this year's fair, and to help sustain that momentum, they also receive a half table at the next fair in 2026. The recipients for this year's fairs are firstly the Pokeweed Collective. Yes. Comprised of University of Alabama graduates and almost graduates. There they are over there. Hello. The people in Pokeweed Collective are Catherine Buckley, Gina Louise Fowler, Millicent Krebs, Urasima Kazada, excuse me, and Jillian Seco. The second person awarded is Bexia Yoke. A transdisciplinary visual artist, bookmaker, scholar, and professor. Yoke runs an independent artist bookbindery and publishing initiative called Thungry, which now resides in Chicago, Illinois. Please visit their tables at the fair, and I'd like to invite Aaron Kohik up to the stage. I want to thank him for helping us to get this program off the ground, and just invite him to say a few quick words before we start our programming here.
Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to have told you all about this fellowship program last Codex cycle, and to have it, the first round be really successful, this one. Thank you to the Codex folks, Peter, Inga, Dina, for all of their work, for letting this whole thing happen, supporting it in many ways. Thank you to everyone who donated to support this program. It really is like a community-run and sponsored program. And I also want to thank our jurors who looked at all the applications. Julie Chen, Islam Ali, Dina Pollack, Carrie Mikilani Schroeder, and Nancy Lober, as well as 2 alternate jurors, Ingrid Schindal and Allison Lealoa Milham, who stepped in at the last minute because we had some people who needed to recuse because we live in a very small book arts world. Thank you, jurors, for all of your work. If anyone wants to think about jurying for the next cycle, find me at the fair and let me know. And I think that's it. And please continue to support it. And as Inga said, come to the tables, welcome the fellows, look at their work, tell other people about their work, and just, yeah, make this the wonderful welcoming place that we all know it is. So thank you.
Okay, I would also like to congratulate Golden Collier. Golden Collier is an MFA student from the Pacific Northwest College of the Arts in Portland, Oregon. Collier is a recipient of our first scholarship supported by both the College Book Art Association and the Codex Foundation. It's more of a research scholarship than it is for exhibitors. So I'm not sure if Golden is here, but congratulations to Golden also. We realize it is sometimes very expensive to come from far away to just visit, maybe to write about the field, to research the field as artists. So that's what this scholarship is for and promotes. And hopefully we can keep doing all of these to help people to come. I just want to take one moment to do also a land acknowledgement. I would like to recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe and other familial descendants of the Verona Band. So for this symposium this year, our theme is translation, both literally, materially, and as metaphor. So I'll start off by introducing our first speaker, Sarah Hulsey. Sarah Hulsey is an artist whose work draws on her background in linguistics to explore the structure of language in a visual domain. She teaches at the Rhode Island School of Design and is represented by Broomfield Gallery in Boston, Massachusetts. She has many distinguished awards and exhibitions under her belt, and her work is collected in many fine institutions and personal collections. I had the pleasure of working with Sarah recently as she did a really outstanding job as guest editor of our newest edition of the Codex Papers Journal, which you can see at the Codex table, full of wonderful essays and reviews. So thank you for that. And with that, I would like to introduce Sarah Hulsey.
Okay, thank you, Inga, and thank you so much to the Codex Foundation for inviting me to speak here today. I'm really happy for the opportunity. I'm going to be speaking about my new artist book, Allochronologies. In 2009, the great British astrophysicist Stephen Hawking gave a party that no one attended. You see, it was a party for time travelers, and he only sent out the invitations afterwards. This is a true story. It was apparently a great disappointment to Hawking because he'd really hoped to show that time travel is possible with his retroactive invitations, and I read that he hoped that a future Miss Universe would show up at his party. So while Stephen Hawking may have been disappointed in his experiments with time, I've become very interested in time for different reasons. What I'm interested in is fiction on the subject of time and its possibilities of scientific reality. I'm particularly gripped by the idea of revisiting a point in one's own past to make a different choice, and all of the possible ramifications of seeing what different outcomes might arise. It's a popular vein in fiction about time travel, of course, but I've also become interested in stories in which time itself doesn't operate in a strictly forward-running way. Alongside fiction, I've become interested in what scientists and philosophers of science have to say about the idea of multiple universes. Also ideas about what might happen at the end of time if the universe collapses into a big crunch, which is the opposite of the Big Bang, and ideas about why time's arrow seems to point irrevocably from what we call the past to what we call the future. All of these theories seem to be compatible, at least hypothetically, with the opportunity to revisit a point in one's own past and see what other paths might have been possible. And these are the subjects of my new artist book, Allochronologies. The book is divided into 3 parts, each of which explores a text or a portion of a text about time. There's 3 volumes contained in this slipcase. First, a note on the title. Allo is a combining form or a bound morpheme that when added to a noun or an adjective means other or different. It's used in words from chemistry and medicine like allozyme, alloantigen, allogenic. It's also used in linguistics in the words allophone, allomorph, allograph. And I was particularly inspired by the term allohistory, which is the literary genre of novels like Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, which imagines a different ending to World War II. Allochronologies consists of 3 volumes, each of which explores an alternate chronology. That is, an alternate world, universe, alternate scenario, whatever you want to call it, in which time operates in a way unfamiliar to us. Each of these chronologies, despite our everyday experience of time, is consistent with the laws of physics. For example, according to the Columbia physicist and mathematician Brian Greene, the mathematics underlying quantum mechanics, or at least one perspective on the math, suggests that all possible outcomes happen, each inhabiting its own separate universe. The first volume in Allochronologies is about multiple universes, and the central text is April March, which is taken from a survey of the works of Herbert Quain by Jorge Luis Borges. The story falls into the Borgesian genre, where he describes a fictional book or series of literary works written by someone else. This is a form that Italo Calvino, in 6 Memos for the Next Millennium, has called the greatest new literary genre of our time, in which Borges invented himself as narrator and pretended that the book he wanted to write had already been written by someone else. In Quain, several works of a recently deceased author, Herbert Quain, are summarized and dissected, including a murder mystery novel, a 2-act comedic play, and the time-based story that interests me, which is called April March. In April March, there's a chapter in which an episode takes place at night on a railway station platform, and that's all that Borges tells us about it, just that brief sketch. It's followed by 3 chapters, each of which describe what might have happened the previous night, and each of those is followed by 3 chapters describing what might have happened the night before that. The result, apparently, is 9 novels in one, each running backwards, more or less. Borges helpfully provides a diagram of the plot. This is the diagram from the first publication of the book, published in Spanish in Buenos Aires in 1941. So Z here represents the night on the railway station platform. Y1, Y2, and Y3 represent the possible preceding night, and X1 through X9 represent the possible night before that. Whatever Borges might have intended, it's difficult today to read this text without thinking of the theory of multiple universes, wherein, at least in the popular imagining, every choice we could make not only might happen, but does happen in a different parallel universe. A somewhat complicating fact for that analogy is that here the branching chapters run backwards, not forwards, but never mind. Approaching this as an artist book, I wanted to make a book that physically enacted this branching diagram, this ramified structure of the story. In thinking about how to activate the diagram, I thought of books like Cortázar's Hopscotch, whose table of contents directs you to read the chapters in a particular nonlinear order. Or the children's series Choose Your Own Adventure, in which the linear reading order is selected by the reader in a series of binary choices. However, I wanted the experience of Borges' diagram to be more of a structural device than written instructions. So for this, I turned to a favorite proto-artist book, Ella Zitsky's For the Voice, a book that will likely be familiar to everyone here. The thumb index that's employed in this book allows the reader to quickly choose between a menu of Mayakovsky's poems, in keeping with its apparent function as a book intended to be read aloud. In order to take Borges' diagram and create a thumbed index, I needed to add a level to the tabs to create 2 layers of choices. I wanted, at any given point, for you to be able to see only the choices available to you at that step. So here, for instance, we're on page Z, the opening chapter, and have the choice of turning to pages Y1, Y2, or Y3. And I've placed the diagram at the top of the slide for reference. So when we're on page Y1, we can choose X1, X2, X3, and so on. The illustrations on these pages are suggestive of the narrative flow of the 9 different novels embedded in April March. Together, these yellow arrow-like shapes make up a composite triangle, mirroring the overall shape of the bracketed diagram. The full shape of the narrative structure of the stories, which would be all of those yellow shapes superimposed upon each other, can be seen on the back of the inner tab section. Before moving on to volume 2, I'll just point out the recurring shape at the top of the slides. Each volume is represented by a symbol that I built up from metal type using the modular future or decorational ornaments. The one used here for volume 1 represents multiple branching universes. It's printed at the beginning of the volume and also foil stamped on the cover. So likewise here, you can see on this cover the composite symbol to represent volume 2, which is meant to be suggestive of a sine wave and is symmetrical on rotation. So another way one could imagine being able to return to a previous point in one's life is if time swung back on itself or oscillated, which is the topic of the second volume of Allochronologies. As the Princeton astrophysicist J. Richard Gott explains, some physicists in the 1960s speculated that quantum effects might allow a cosmology collapsing towards a big crunch to bounce and make another big bang. This could lead to an oscillating universe with an endless sequence of big bangs and big crunches. So here's a second bizarre notion of how time might actually work, available to us courtesy of modern physics and cosmology. For a literary perspective on these ideas about time and the cosmos, I turn to a short story by the great Italian novelist and storyteller Italo Calvino. In the third quarter of the 20th century, Calvino was very interested in contemporary developments in physics and used them as the basis of many of the stories in his wonderful collection, Cosmocomics. According to Alan Lightman, the writer and MIT professor, it seems that Calvino is attempting to fathom how much of reality can be created without the familiar geography of time and space. He plays with science the way a found object artist throws together bits of silvered glass, odd metal brackets, bits of colored paper. In volume 2 of Allochronologies, I use excerpts from Calvino's 1967 story, T0, which is a story about an arrow, a lion, and an archer, frozen in a moment of time. In that moment of frozen time, the archer doesn't know if the arrow he's just released is about to kill the lion or the leaping lion about to kill him. Through the musings of the archer narrator, Calvino explores wide-ranging possibilities of ideas about time, including probabilities, multiple worlds, diverging outcomes, reversals of time in which effects lead to causes, the doubling and superimposing of near-identical stretches of time, and much more. For my book, I freely pulled out parts of the text and used this discontinuous series of meditations on the nature of time. I chose to focus on one vein that runs through the archer's musings and to which he keeps returning, the notion of an oscillating universe, a universe that goes forwards and then backwards over and over, again and again. For example, at one point he says, "The suspicion that has gripped me is precisely this, that I've come to find myself in a space not new to me, that I've returned to a point where we had already passed by." And at another point he thinks that it might be best to just stand still, frozen in time, and let the universe run forward and then backward while he's stationary, waiting a few billion years for the universe to catch back up to him, frozen here at time t sub 0. This book can be read along the top half of each page, that is the portion above the waveform, until the end of the volume is reached. There, when the book is flipped upside down, one encounters a second title page, identical to the one on the other side of the book. One can then read from this direction and encounter the exact same text, now along the other side of the waveform. If you read back to the starting point, this action can be done again and again, forwards and backwards. However, there's a second way to read it as well. Since the excerpts of the story are non-contiguous, within each opening, one can read the right side up text, then spin the book, and continue to read what had been upside down, before returning to the original position to continue forward. Here in the center of the book is an illustration suggestive of the full expansion and contraction of the universe. Through the middle runs a portion of a sound wave that runs throughout the entire book and divides the two directions of time, the two directions of reading. The sound wave is a rendering of Carl Sagan describing the oscillating theory of the universe on the PBS series Cosmos in an episode entitled The Edge of Forever. Whether you read it as a continuous text along the top and then along the bottom, or flip each opening to read all four portions, the entire text appears on each side of this central expanding and collapsing image. Here on the outside, you can see that this book reads the same from the front as from the back, as the symbol for the oscillating universe appears on both the upper and the lower covers. There's a third way that one can imagine returning to a critical moment, and that's if time temporarily ran backwards. That is, if what's called time's arrow, or the asymmetry of time, instead ran in the opposite direction. It's a complicated idea, the idea of experiencing time running in reverse. Essentially, it involves entropy working in the opposite direction. Shards of glass on the floor fly upwards to form a wine glass on the kitchen counter. Ashes in the fireplace burn to form themselves into a log. People age in reverse. There are a lot of wonderful and disturbing stories like this, from F. Scott Fitzgerald's Benjamin Button story to Philip K. Dick's Counterclock World. This idea, too, is grounded in the physics and philosophy of time. As Stephen Hawking tells us in A Brief History of Time, the laws of science do not distinguish between the forward and backward direction of time. And this opens up wonderful possibilities for fiction and for art. For the third variant in Allochronologies, I chose a section of a novel called Einstein's Dreams by Alan Lightman. The premise is that in 1905, as he's working out the ideas in his theory of relativity, Einstein has a series of dreams about worlds in which time operates differently from our own, one of which involves the reversal of time's arrow. To give you a flavor of how odd and evocative this story is, I'll just read the first paragraph. A mushy brown peach is lifted from the garbage and placed on the table to pinken. It pinkens, it turns hard, it is carried in a shopping sack to the grocer's, put on a shelf, removed and crated, returned to the tree with pink blossoms. In this world, time flows backwards. Each of the 4 paragraphs of the story describes a sketch of a different character for whom time moves backwards. In this volume, I've printed Lightman's story 4 different times. I'll tell you about them in the reverse order, that is, how they appear from the back of the book moving forwards. Fourthly, or lastly, which is pictured here, I printed the story as Lightman wrote it. Thirdly, you find the same story, but with the sentences reversed. So in this photo, you can see the start of that portion on the top part of the left-hand page. And note that by reversing all the sentences, it also reverses the order of the paragraphs. So I marked the paragraphs in the margins for ease of identification. Next is a version with all of the words reversed. So the same paragraph we've been looking at, this version has as a closing sentence, pinken to table thee on placed, and garbage thee from lifted is peach brown, mushy A. So we have the original, then the sentence is reversed, then the words reversed, and lastly, or firstly, is printed a version with all of the sounds reversed. I'll show that one in a little bit more detail now. The best way I can explain what I did is first by showing you something similar from Martin Amis's novel, Time's Arrow. In that story, the main character experiences time running backwards relative to the rest of the story. Early on, he has to make sense of what people are saying, which to him seems to be running in reverse. So he goes to a pharmacy, and when asked, "How are you today?" hears, "Eight, oot, ooh, yura?" And when he responds, "Good, how are you?" hears himself say, "Doug, oh, yura?" Amis confines the description of this experience to this one conversational exchange, after which the character sorts it out and can convert the backwards speech in his head. Presumably, it would tax the reader too much to have to make sense of this nonsense and interrupt the flow of the novel. To see how this works in Allochronologies, here's paragraph 1 of the text in this format. So I didn't simply reverse the letters of the written words, just as Amis did not. If one truly experienced a reversal of time, what one would hear, I presume, is something more akin to the soundtrack of a movie running backwards. So as you might imagine, this was quite a fun game, and let me play around with my background in linguistics. As some of you might know, I started out in linguistics, and much of my art is based on visualizing the structure of language. One of the subfields of linguistics is phonetics, which is the study of the pronunciation of sounds. So it was a lot of fun and occasional aggravation to go through and work out how to pronounce all of these words backwards using only the Roman alphabet and not any kind of specialized phonetic alphabet like IPA. I am still waiting for someone to design and cast a metal typeface of the International Phonetic Alphabet. I am not kidding. If you are interested, please talk to me. So here's the same paragraph 1 again. Just a brief translation of the slide. You can read the original of this paragraph if you want to from reading the orange text from the bottom to the top, from the right to the left. Or reading the first line as I've printed it, you get Durquab Zolf might dolur sith ne. That is, backward flows time, world, this in. Some of the words in this format are easy and pronounceable. So shelf becomes flesh, peach becomes cheap, but others aren't pronounceable as English words. Shopping becomes ngaposh, blossoms becomes zmolzbob, or something like that. So this is the beginning of Allochronologies Volume 3. At the top you see the title of the chapter, the title of the novel, and the author's name. So the title of this chapter is the date, 2 June 1905, which here is rendered in reverse. So 5091 Nuge for June 2. And then a backwards running version of Einstein's Dreams, followed by a reversal of Alan Lightman. The order of each of the 4 versions is reflected in the headers of this volume as well, which change depending on which version we're in. So the original, the one with the sentences reversed, the words reversed, and the sounds reversed. So here again are the 3 different volumes of this book with the modular symbols stamped on the front, as I've shown. There's also a deluxe version. So this edition has a box with an angled lid and a yellow leather spine label. There's also a line of inlaid yellow leather that runs around the box and inside the lid. This line meets at the leather spines of the volumes, which are stamped in silver foil with a matching line. This is meant to be suggestive of a timeline running throughout the entire project, crossing and running through all of the stories in the book. This line continues onto the printed paper covers of this version, each of which has a printed line drawing reflecting the alternate chronology in that volume. So on the left, we have the April-March story and an illustration of branching universes running forwards and backwards. In the middle, for volume 2, T0, there's a complex wave function, which is identical on the front and back covers, only one of which is visible here. And on the right, we have time's arrow running backwards for the story 2 June 1905. Allochronologies explores alternate notions of time that don't adhere to our ordinary experience. It was a pleasant, if often baffling, realization to find that some of the more outlandish ideas in novels and stories about how time could work do actually coincide with ideas that philosophers and physicists have about time. The book brings together stories that take elegant, esoteric scientific ideas about time from a selection of some of the more imaginative and inventive authors of the 20th century. By juxtaposing these differing stories and manifesting them physically in the way the books are manipulated and read, Allochronologies upends the usually linear order of books and suggests different ways of engaging with the idea of time itself as a function of reading. Taken all together, these alternate chronologies let the mind wander freely, imagining counterfactual scenarios in which one could revisit, or at least an alternate version of oneself could revisit, points already lived and imagine alternative outcomes. Alternative lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much. Somehow I'm not surprised that that ended exactly at 20 minutes. So we are trying to work in some time for questions. We don't have a whole lot of time, depending on how people go, but we have a few minutes, so I'll be brief. Would anybody like to ask Sarah a question? I'll hand you the microphone about this wonderful project.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask again, the Carl Sagan talk that you mentioned, I missed what the title of it was and just wanted to know what that was again.
Oh, yeah, so I was looking for a sound file that had something to do with the oscillating universe, and on the PBS program Cosmos, one of the episodes was called The Edge of Forever, and Carl Sagan talks about, yeah, the oscillating universe in that one. Yeah.
I'm going to go this way because we'll head over to Richard next.
I'm wondering if you could tell me how much time you spent on this book.
Well, it started about 2.5 years ago. So I don't know, maybe a year kind of working out the ideas and the design, and then 1.5 years with the production. I had 2 really amazing studio assistants helping with all of this. It would not have been possible in that amount of time to do this project. And then Amy Barizo did the binding for the deluxe edition, which she's a really amazing binder, so that really was a great thing to be able to work with her.
Kubzi, the next F. Rue.
My book is already working, and time is running backwards for some people, it seems like.
Say, what is your next book?
I don't know. I should settle down after this one. I made the title pages of this book sort of suggestive of an ongoing version of Allochronologies, implying that there would be more. I don't really know. To check back in with you.
Over here.
I love the fact that you explore these variations in time by compelling or allowing the reader to manipulate the traditional codex structure. I'm wondering if you had considered looking at manipulating the structure itself.
You know, I hadn't. This really started, I was doing a lot of reading about time, not even looking for an artist book project. I was just reading science fiction and other kinds of fiction about time. And I ran across that Borges story, and it was really just that diagram. I love diagrams, and seeing a diagram printed in this story made me start thinking about how could you make that into a physical object. And then I went from there. Yeah, I didn't really think about manipulating the codex itself for this project, but I could see that working really well as well.
Hi, I was wondering if you could share some of the production details with it. Is it hand set? What sort of paper did you choose to put it on? Those sort of details that relate somehow to time.
Sure. There's a really wonderful printer just outside of Boston, Daryl Hyder, who was retiring. He's from Sun Hill Press, and I was able to buy his entire run of Universe, which is the title of the name of the type that I use, as it happens. So I was able to buy 55 and 65, so regular and bold, Roman and oblique, all the way from 6-point to 48-point, and I had someone cast the body type monotype. From Daryl's mats. So we didn't hand set all of the type. I hand distributed all of the type, but all of the titles were set. Paper was Mohawk Superfine. What else? The images were done with polymer plates. And with the tabs, I have a CNP press that I use for die cutting, so I made dies to cut the edges of those tabs. But it was all printed by hand on the Vandercook in my studio.
Any other questions? You can find Sarah at her table number
69.
69. So thank you, Sarah. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Radha Pandey. Radha is the proprietor of Halden Bookworks. She is a papermaker and letterpress printer. She specializes in particular in Indo-Islamic papermaking and teaches book arts classes in India, Europe, and the US. Her award-winning work resides in over 80 collections internationally and is an inspiring blend of craft traditions surrounding the history of the book with her own contemporary commentary. So please welcome Radha.
I'd like to thank Codex Foundation for inviting me here today, and to all of you for showing up this morning. Flora of Mughal India is about nature. This book is about beauty versus money, love versus power, legacy versus economy. It's about how we see the world around us. It's about nature and how we choose to represent nature, and how that representation shapes our perception. Take, for instance, this beautiful illustration of the iris. What is it that we can glean from this representation? For me, it's beauty. It's an uprooted plant. It's a study. It's hand-painted. It's described in keen detail in the text, and even though I can't read Latin, the visual created by the text block gives me the impression of something very serious and important that's being disclosed, something heavy with information. Compared to this image of the iris, which shows the plant not botanically correct if we consider its proportions, it's more an idea of an iris, if you will. With a butterfly around it, nothing seems too real. There's the hint of the earth, the hint of a sky, and the complete spread of the book could look something like this, with poetry for text next to an illustration, a completely hand-done illustration at that. With borders, rich borders adding to this to complete the look. So these two elements, the main illustration and the border, were usually done separately by separate hands and then carefully attached together. So now when we compare these two aesthetics, both are beautiful, but both are very different in style, in quality, and meant for two completely different audiences, if you think about it. Ironically, very few of these manuscripts are in Indian collections today. So this is from the Dara Shikoh album. And if I wanted to see this album in person, I'd have to apply for a visa to the UK, get a flight ticket, an appointment at the British Library, which is free and open to all, if only you can afford to get there. Sometimes up to 6 people could work on a single illustration. So this is a simple, quote-unquote, simple illustration of a plant. But if it was a portrait of a king, there would be one person blocking out all the colors, one person doing just the backgrounds and borders, one person doing just the fabrics, one person doing just the face, one person doing just the gold highlights. With the arrival of the British and the dissolution of the courts, the patronage for all those beautiful books and their makers dwindled. And so all these skilled artists that were making these amazing books and works of art, essentially, were employed by the East India Company. And they ended up making the same books that I showed you earlier, which are complete sort of at odds with each other. They ended up using different materials, different papers, and painted images on these dark backdrops. So even though the artists were the same, the works ended up looking very different. And this style now is called company kalam, which translates roughly to company style. And they were reproduced as lithographs, so again, hand-painted in some cases. But images like these were made in books that could take up to 15 years to complete. Just one book, 15 years, with multiple people working on each page. And it's from this tradition of the art of the book in India that I found inspiration to work on a project titled Flora of Mughal India, or Gulistaan-e-Hind. This book is about floral portraiture in the Mughal miniature tradition and how it was impacted by colonial interests in the commercialization of plants. A modified sewn boards binding divides the book in 2 parts. The binding has been done by Adam Bryant. It's meant to be viewed simultaneously. The left side opens in a European format, and it contains the text, and the right side opens as an Islamic codex, and it contains the illustrations. The papers used in the book are a combination of raw hemp and recycled hemp papers. And half of the papers have been colored using a yellow dye, which were prepared specially for the edition. The coloring is painted on, so each sheet looks slightly different with the brushstrokes visible. The paper was made in the traditional way as it would have been made in the 15th century in a town called Sanganer in India. And there's about 7 families in all of India working in this paper tradition only. The sheets were unsized and were polished or burnished to a high shine. And what that does is that it closes up the fiber so that the ink sit on top of the surface of the finished sheets. And so these same papers, if you can imagine, were used for those illuminated manuscripts that we saw a few slides ago, but they worked perfectly on the letterpress as well. The illustrations for Flora of Mughal India are done using wood engravings in collaboration with a miniature painter, Jai Prakash Lakhewalji, based in Delhi. My thought was to print multi-block illustrations and then ask the miniature painter to embellish the image, as it were, in whatever way that he saw fit. So in these proofs, you can see the difference between the first layer, where I'm just blocking out the colors, and then the print after 2 additional layers. As it turned out, the miniature painter preferred to work on the base layer instead of the more complete image, which, when I think about it now, makes sense because that's exactly how he would have been working with a miniature painting from scratch. He would first block out all the colors and then fill in all the details. Jaiprakash ji worked with pictures that I had taken as references and used the color values that I had set in my base print. Just to clarify, miniature painting doesn't necessarily mean that the paintings themselves are miniature and tiny. It's just that the brushstrokes are small and made with a squirrel hairbrush with a single hair at the end, and layered to create variations in opacity. So they're typically created using natural pigments and very, very light layers. So it takes a long time to build up all the layers. Working together, one of the things we discovered along the way was that even though the burnished paper was perfect for printing wood blocks in metal type, the paints that the painter was using tended to bead on the paper surface. So a few of the illustrations, as you can see in this image, first needed a layer of a natural soap from the soap nut tree, and then paint on top. And so some of the resulting illustrations became quite dimensional. You can see the petals of this flower. I printed the borders on the sheets in Norway, while Jaiprakash ji worked on the illustrations in Delhi, so we worked separately. And then I cut out the central rectangle on my base sheet and tipped in the illustrations when they were ready. But one of the unexpected side effects, which took me completely by surprise, was that all of the finished paintings were slightly larger than my base print. And so, oh my God, now what? So I sat and trimmed around all these petals and overlapped them on the borders, which actually you see in historical manuscripts if you have ever had the chance to look at one. So the border pattern is taken from Akbar's tomb. You can see it here. So it's just part of this, part of the tomb that I used to create that border pattern. And Akbar the Great ruled India in the 1500s, and he was a lover of literature and set up the first libraries and really promoted the art of the book. And this is Jahangir's tomb, and the floor also had that same pattern, which I was amazed but not surprised to find. Jahangir is Akbar's son, and he also loved the arts of the book. Miniature paintings were never meant to be editioned. Like I said, one person, 6 people working on, one image. And so for this edition of 20, the miniaturist adapted by having multiple artists working on the one piece, which is really clear in the illustration on the right. Here you can see that Jaiprakash ji worked on the flower petals. His father worked on the branches. His brother, the least experienced, worked on the leaves. And even though this was unexpected, and I had no idea this was happening, it was really unique to the original methods of working and gave the book an added dimension. The texts that correspond to each illustration are a combination of a personal narrative set against a historical backdrop. So you have a sense of what was happening in time as you go through the book. And these are juxtaposed with couplets in Urdu, printed together with a Hindi translation and an English transliteration. I tried for about half a year to find metal type in Urdu and Hindi with absolutely no luck, which kind of surprised me. I was sure a foundry in Germany would have a matrix in Urdu, and they did, but the person that cast that type had just retired, so there was no way I was getting my hands on that type. There were also people printing in Devanagari in India, in Delhi and in Jaipur and places like that, smaller towns, but they didn't want to part with their type. Understandably, they were still using it. So I asked a calligrapher in Bombay to work with the text that I was given, and I turned her calligraphy into polymer plates. A foil stamp representing the flower in question has been used as a wayfinding mechanism on both the text and the image sides, so just in case someone has no idea what a lotus looks like or doesn't have the patience to sit and read a book, then they can just identify the foil stamps and find their way through the book. These motifs were designed by breaking down each of the 9 flowers in the book to their basic essence and applying the rules of Islamic manuscript illumination, turning them into the motifs that are used throughout the book in the foil stamps, but also on the title page. That title page image is adapted from the Tree of Life stone lattice at the Sidi Sayyid Mosque in Ahmedabad. One of the things that set me down the path for this book actually was coming to California for one of these codexes and seeing all the trees and flowers that I thought was so typically Indian and being blown away that they were here in California. And after reading a bit, I realized that the British had a lot to do with the spread of certain species of plants all over the world. In fact, they built ships that were essentially greenhouses to transport plants across the world, the sole purpose for which was, of course, trade and economy and curiosity. So the 9 flowers that I chose for the book are also those that are originally from the Indian subcontinent, a few of which aren't seen anywhere else because they had no economic value to the British, their only value being beauty, not money. The special end sheet for the half title page on the right was hand cut by a master craftsman, Ram Soni ji in Alwar. He uses, in this tradition called Sanji, they use scissors, and the scissors are actually made specifically to the thickness of their fingers. So each person has a specific set of scissors that only they use. I wanted this image to frame the opening of the book and set the tone for the reader. And Ram Soni ji chose the dark indigo dyed banana fiber paper, and then he had it gold leafed on one side, and then he cut it out with those scissors. That pattern is based on tile work at a place called Fatehpur Sikri, which was one of Akbar's courts. This is Ram Soni ji drawing with scissors, as I like to call it. So he's doing a demonstration for a group, and there was no drawing before, he just started cutting. He's cutting to 3 layers of paper in that one. The fold-out maps, of which there are 2, contain a few hand-drawn and handwritten elements. This map outlines the extent of the Mughal Empire from the 16th to 18th centuries. And this one shows us the trade routes used by the British in Southeast Asia. To handwrite and draw the lines in these maps was one of the decisions I took towards the end of the production of the book, and I did so looking at all the pieces come together to make a whole. I saw the paper, in which, in many cases, had the literal fingerprint of the maker on it, the paintings, where one can see 3 hands at work, the Urdu calligraphy, which reminds me of the person who wrote the poetry, each time I look at a spread, the end sheets that were cut by hand. And so the handwritten words and drawn lines on the map just seem to make it a more complete representation of all the people behind the making of this edition. And just like one book is a bridge to the next, my next project came a little early. And I hope you'll get to meet him today. This project wouldn't have been possible without the support of grants. College Book Arts Association, the Print Book Artist Scholar of Color Collective, and Griffil, an organization in Norway. Thank you.
It's a stunning, stunning project. And I'm sure you have questions. Maybe I can start with one. You were saying that typically editions weren't made, but I'm assuming yours was an edition. How many did you make?
It's an edition of 20.
Do we have other questions for Radha?
You showed some, the paper polishing. Were those agates?
They were,
Those
yes.
big stones, and did you polish the paper?
No, I did not.
Do you
The
know how?
paper makers,
Do you know how they do? Do they do it in a circle? Do they
they do it up and down.
just up and down, and then they go back and forth?
Yes, and then this ways as well.
I always wondered how they did that.
Other questions? Great. Let's see if I can make it to you. No, you're okay. I think there's so much room. I can walk right there.
I'm curious about the soap that you mentioned, and then how it made the illumination dimensional. Could you say more?
I wish I could explain it better, but I showed up at his studio and he said, "Was this paper great to print on?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, it was horrible to paint on." And I said, "Okay." He said, "This is not the paper you gave me when you gave me the samples to try." And I said, "Okay, I mean, maybe I got messed it up." So then he said, "But I fixed it, don't worry." So I said, "Okay, what did you do?" He said, "Well, the paint was beading, and what we do typically is make this sort of base layer using soap from the soap nut tree. So they're nuts, and you crush them and you add them in water, and people use them to wash woolens in India. It's like a very gentle wash, but you can make a thick, gummy paste out of it. So first he painted over the entire base print using that, almost like a gum solution, but it's not mixed with pigment. And then the paint easily stuck onto the base.
Thank you for making this, Pandey. First, Radha, sorry. But I'm just curious about the people, the painters, and the cutter. Where did you find these people? Were they people you had previous relationships with, or I'm just interested in the collaborative process.
Yeah, from Ram Soneji, the person who was doing the Sanji cutting, I'd taken a workshop with him maybe 20 years ago, and he remembered me. And so when I came to him with the project, he was really excited because it's not often that you get to just do something for fun when you're doing something like what he does. And the miniature painter I contacted through a crafts council, something called the Crafts Council of India. They put me in touch with him. I had no idea there was a miniature painter sitting in the middle of Delhi. And so I found him. He had a little studio near the train station, and tiny little place, 3 people sitting on the ground, working on huge pieces. Turned out he was a national award winner. He makes paintings for the Prime Minister. And so he was extremely enthusiastic again because of the collaborative aspect. and also just working on something different, I think, instead of working on portraits, which he mostly does.
Can I? Yeah. Radha, thank you so much. It's been wonderful watching this book come together over social media. And yesterday when you showed it to me, there's an element that wasn't discussed in your talk, which is the structural element of the box and how the book is propped up so that you can read both simultaneously upright. Was your original intention that it be read flat, where you would open it and then the box came later? And then, just as a side note, could you just elaborate a little bit on what the actual text is?
What the actual text is?
Yeah.
Yeah, the text is a combination of a personal narrative, which has to do with all of the 9 plants, so individually, and it's set against the historical backdrop of what was happening with the art of the book in India. So if you read that section of the book, you'll get kind of a survey of that time. And then there's Urdu poetry, the couplets. So each of those lines has to do with the plant, with a translation in Hindi and a transliteration in English. Originally, I had thought that one would read the book flat, but then I thought of tables and just space and how you would be sitting or standing while actually reading this book and engaging with it. And so I thought of the structure that a lot of Quran are kept on, and I kind of wanted to replicate that somehow in a box. And Adam, actually, who's doing the binding, helped me come up with that lovely supported structure, which I think works so well.
I'll come back. There's one more ahead of you. I told them there would only probably be a couple questions.
Hi, that is wonderful, just so beautiful and complicated. And I just have a quick question about how geographically dispersed were your collaborators? It sounds like they were really all over the place, and the collaboration was one from enormous distances.
Well, I was printing in Norway, so maybe that was the furthest. Everybody else was in India. Rajasthan and Delhi are the 2 places. They're about 5 hours apart by car, and then the binder lives in the United States.
Wow.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question. We have one back here, and after that, you can visit Radha at her table.
You mentioned the painting, the parts of the painting being done by members of a family. Mm-hmm. And so I have 2 questions. One, was that common traditionally? And is it something that you believe will continue and has a future?
I don't think it was common traditionally, although the apprentice relationship could extend to the family. In this case, the person's father is a self-taught miniature painter, which is really extremely rare. He was a railway engineer before that. He taught himself miniature painting and then taught his sons. The fact that they're national level painters speaks for itself. I do think it will continue when you're that good. I think there's no way you can't not have it continue. Thank you. Please come to table 109.
I want to also thank Clifton, who is our videographer here for the day and tomorrow. He did the video for our event at the last symposium, did a great job, and from last fair, those are up online, and these will also be, the talks will be online as well. Okay, so now it's my pleasure to introduce Forrest Gander, a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and translator with degrees in geology and literature. Forrest was born in the Mojave Desert and lives in Northern California. His most recent book is Twice Alive, An Ecology of Intimacies, I meant to ask you how to pronounce one or two of these, so you might have to correct me when you come up here. Among his recent translations are It Must Be a Misunderstanding, I love that title, by Coral Bracco, Names and Rivers by Shuri Kido, Then Come Back, The Lost Neruda Poems, and Spectacle and Pigsty, thank you, by Kiwao Nomura, winner of the Best Translated Book Award. Gander's essays have appeared in The Nation, The Boston Review, and The New York Times Book Review. He is a recipient of fellowships from the Library of Congress, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Guggenheim, Howard United States Artists, and Whiting Foundations, and we are very thrilled to have him here. I would also mention that Forrest brought some of his recent book projects, which are at the table out front. So please know that you can check them out there. Okay, welcome, Forrest.
Yeah, just the last two presentations and being at Codex reminds me of how sensual, how much the body is involved in the making of these books. Radha's book, you know, I just wanted to lick. And Sarah's book, you want to just step into and then divide methodically. It was hard to spend less than 30 minutes at each table I went to yesterday. Okay, I'm talking about translation and translating the so-called untranslatable. Berkeley poet Robert Hass turned me on to the poem I'm about to share with you, and I'm afraid I'll find it necessary to involve you just once in a participatory act of the translation from a language that I know none of you speak. So let's consider for a moment how we might translate a short Oglala Sioux poem. Ike size wayon kon he, wana hena la yelo he, iotie kia wayon. This is a poem song composed by Tatanka Yontake, more commonly known to us as Sitting Bull, in the Lakota language, as recited by a Lakota informant used as a shield for the ethnomusicologist Francis Densmore at Standing Rock in 1914, which was 24 years after the assassination of Sitting Bull, the great warrior and Wikasa Wakan, or holy man and healer. The poem was composed by Sitting Bull after the return of the Oglala Sioux to the United States from Canada, where they had fled after defeating the US cavalry at Wounded Knee. In Canada, the tribe was reduced to starvation by two of the hardest winters in a century on the Canadian plains. Tatanka Yontake led his people back to the US and negotiated their surrender and their settlement on a reservation. He returned from those negotiations to his people and recited this. So let's go through some of the words. Ikesize, head warrior, or literally one who confronts things face to face. Wayon is going to be important, it'll come up again at the end. To know or to know how. Kon, to want. He, in the old days they would call this a meaningless terminal rhythmic syllable, but rhythm is never meaningless. And in this case, it serves as an intensifier, as it does in a lot of Scandinavian languages. Wana, now. Henala, all gone. Yellow, a stress particle. Iotie, to suffer, to find difficult, and literally to crash against something. Kia, an auxiliary verb meaning to make, to be. And wayon, you already know because I told you from the first line, means to know or to know how. But it's also that, well, the nickname for bears in Lakota is wayonze, which derives from wayon because bears were considered wise healers and warriors who protected the Lakota. So we could have a translation that when the transliteration, something like head warrior know how to want, hey, now all gone, hey, to suffer, to make, to know how. Not a very good translation yet. Perhaps I knew how to be or how to want to be a head warrior, to confront things face to face. Now that is all gone, and I know how to be made to suffer, to crash against things. But one more detail. Remember, this poem song was recited and not written, and that it was recited to a guy who happened to be a musicologist, who wrote down the tonal pattern. And it turns out that it's in the key of E flat minor with a descending fourth and two cascading thirds, which makes it very much like the prophetic Meadowlark's song, which turns out, though Densmore had no idea of this, to be Sitting Bull's oracle that warned him from childhood of danger. So now we have to have the audience participation part. You got to get the first line. So, Ike size wayon kon he. Ike size wayon kon he. Okay, one more time. Good. It's got to come out of the body. 1, 2, 3. Ike size wayon kon he. And now, let's listen to that bird. Now we probably won't get the bird. Ike size wayon kon he. Ike size wayon kon he. So, that adds to the complication of translating this, because Sitting Bull's audience all would have recognized that the bird sound and made the connection to Sitting Bull's totem animal. So how do you translate that? Here's Francis Densmore's translation of it. A warrior I have been, now it is all over, a hard time I have. And Kenneth Lincoln tries to preserve an echo of Lakota feeling for bears with an English pun. So I have been a warrior, and now it is all over, so I know to bear against hard times. Neither of those translators tries to bring into English the intensifying sound hey, although Lincoln may be trying to make a rough equivalent with his two so's. If we think about it as translators, we might come up with several ways to create an effect similar to the hey hey. Or even better, according to me, we might leave those sounds as they are and bring into the translation something of the original. Nietzsche called the Roman translations of Greek a form of conquest, because the Romans would fill their translations of Greek poems with their own loose interpretations, variations, improvisations, and erasures. Early translations were often liberal rewritings. Without copyrights or intellectual property, writing was considered a common inheritance. You could do with it what you wanted. But historically, scholars will tell you that translation theory has moved from the acceptance of what has now come to be called predation of original words and forms, as maybe Thomas Wyatt lifts the templates for his poems from the Italian sonnet, or from that predation to a respect for the original forms and words. That's what they tell us, but I wonder what it means really to respect the original forms and words. Like, what about that hey hey? What about the fact that the words that Sitting Bull uses have birdsong in them? And what about, for instance, with works like Tale of Genji, for which there is no original manuscript? A horse neighs or whinnies in English, but in Chinese it goes xiao xiao. Just as people see things differently, I think of the image of the moon in Mexico, where I've done a lot of translation. If you ask a kid what they see when they look at a full moon, they see a rabbit playing a guitar. In the United States, it's often the face of a man. People also hear sounds differently. Even the incidental sounds we make are culturally patterned. So when filling in blank moments in speech, the Japanese will say, ito, ano. Americans say, yeah, like now. Hi, I'm Peter and Susan, honored to have you here. Yeah. No. The British say air, Spanish and Hebrew both say e. In Mexico, it's common to hear como este. And in Arabic, they say yani, it is. Do you think a Japanese ito can be translated as an American What does it mean to respect original words? Aren't words also sounds? End rhyme and meter are still really common features in contemporary Russian poetry. But what happens to our respect for the original form if in Russian, which is a highly inflected language that allows for a wide variety of word order in any given sentence, rhyming words can have various grammatical functions, but in English, they're most often translated into noun-noun rhymes that sound to the Russians contemptibly amateurish. Already, I imagine that you're answering some of these questions to yourselves. We know that rhymed and metered Russian poetry has been translated often into English and Chinese in various ways. And all of us who translate poetry are aware that semantic meaning is only one kind of meaning, that sound and word textures suggest other meanings that we as translators of poetry attend to in one way or another. In fact, there's a really fascinating Israeli linguist, Reuven Tzur, who talks about how the meanings of sound affect humans, that we get those meanings before we ever get semantic meanings, and that there are rhythms that are common in almost all languages, the way that women talk to babies with an uplilting tilt to their voice, that a rhythmic pattern like means no, that the long O and U sounds are connected to deeper emotions than the sort of tweeter vowel sounds, and that all of those are felt as meaning, as emotional meaning, before you ever get to the semantic meaning. But what about really radical literary works that have been called untranslatable? This is Su Hui's palindromic infinite poem. It is one of the earliest extant poems by a woman. It's also among the most complex, and it's unsung in Chinese, which is very unusual. It takes the form of a 29 by 29 character grid, embroidered or woven in 5 colors of silk, written in classical Chinese in the 4th century. I get excited about this. This is where it gets good. It can be read forward or backward, horizontally, vertically, or diagonally, as well as within the coded color grids. One of the most compelling translations of this poem for me is a large artwork by Jen Bervin, which was seen most recently at the terrific Catherine Clark Gallery in San Francisco. Here's another case that may interest you. Sometime during the first millennium in South India, a Jain monk named Kumandendu Mundi composed on palm leaves what is perhaps the most radical and spectacular work of literature in any language. The story doesn't have a precise beginning, but we could drop into the court of Rishabhanatha in Uttar Pradesh, India, at about 800 CE, which is during the same long dynasty that celebrated Buddha and Lord Rama. There, a philosopher-poet, a real philosopher-poet named Kumandendu, watches his old king divide the kingdom between his two sons. We've heard this story before. Predictably, the siblings end up going to war with each other over the territory. The younger son, Bahubali, wins, but he's so disgusted by the enmity that twisted his mind that he decides to hand over the whole kingdom to his brother and make himself a Digambara, which is a member of that sect of Jain monks who renounce ownership and wear no clothes. You still see them. I just saw naked Jain monks in the middle of the city in Mumbai. He becomes known as Gomata and is memorialized in a 57-foot high statue constructed in 983 and long known as the largest freestanding monolithic statue in the world on a famous hill that I visited in Karnataka. Impressive. Gomata's older brother accepts the kingdom but feels contrite, and inspired by his brother's renunciation, he asks Gomata to teach him how to become wise. And here's where the story gets interesting. Gomata remembers that after their kingly father bestowed his territories upon his two sons, he called for his two daughters to sit on his lap and hold out their palms. In the Jain tradition, the giving of knowledge is more valuable than giving food, shelter, or money. It was to his daughters that the king bequeathed his most lasting gift. On the palm of one daughter, he drew the numbers 0 and 1. On the palm of the other, he drew the 64 letters of the Kannada alphabet. Kannada is a language in southern India, in Karnataka. Between this number and these letters, he told them, you'll have access to all the knowledge of the world. Gomata follows his father's example and gives to his brother a cipher for the wisdom he seeks. And Kumandendu, that court poet who's closely watching all of this drama, realizes it might be a cool idea for him to render the long philosophical poem he's writing into a code, so that if his life work is destroyed, it might be reconstructed from the code again and again. So it comes about that Kumandendu writes and codes the Siri Bhuvalaya, a poem of some 600,000 verses, making it 6 times larger than the Mahabharata. Within its structure, there are reputed to be works in dozens of languages in at least 18 scripts. The Siri Bhuvalaya was recognized in its time as a major literary work, and copies were made and distributed among Jain sects all through the 9th century. But over subsequent centuries, wars, and waves of cultural eradication, even these facsimiles gradually disappeared. Then in early 1950s, one handwritten copy on Kori paper was discovered by a man named Yalapa Shastri in a village near Bengaluru in Karnataka. The owner wouldn't part with the book, so in order to win his confidence, Shastri married the owner's niece. But his strategy still didn't work. Shastri didn't get to actually hold the book in his hands until the owner died, and because Shastri was poor, he had to sell his wife's bangles to buy it. The Siri Bouvalea, like Lucretius's On the Nature of Things, or Parmenides' Influential on Nature, is a philosophical poem, but it contains sections on mathematics, chemistry, astronomy, medicine, and space travel. It also contains versions of the Bhagavad Gita, the Rig Veda, and the Upanishads, and other major texts. Kannada, the main language spoken by its author, has a literary history stretching back more than 1,000 years. Among Kannada's gems are the 13th century Life of Harishchandra by Raghavanka, which was recently translated in English for the Murti Classical Library, the 19th century Kavira Jamarga, a definitive book on Kannada grammar and poetics, in the 10th century Vikramarujina Vijaya by Pampa Bharata, who was, like the author of the Siri Bouvalea, a Jain monk. The multilingual poem can be rendered in the Sangathya meter, which is the meter of the classical Kannada script. But I say rendered instead of written because the work's most unique feature is that it's composed of numerals, not words, arranged in a crossword fashion as chakras or matrices of 729 squares, 27 by 27 integers, whose systemically coded patterns can be translated into phonemes and words. Sometimes the sentences are embedded across the entire chakra, but often the sentencing is organized into what mathematicians now call magic squares, written within the larger structure. In 1953 and 1955, the first 2 volumes of research and translation into modern Kannada of the Siri Bouvalea appeared. In 56, because that Kori paper was in bad condition, all the pages were microfilmed at the National Archives in New Delhi. More recently, 2 volumes of deciphered text and critical apparatus, that's this, were published in Bengaluru, and the first of those volumes was translated into Hindi so more readers would know about it. Some have already called the Siri Bouvalea the first microchip literature. Such are the claims. How, you are wondering, I imagine, do those claims pan out? Well, with the help of one Dr. Narasimhan in Karnataka, and with the Kannada literature scholar and sculptor Ashwini Bhatt, I worked through the first sentence of an early chakra, 1.10.2, which looks like this. Looks like this. This large chakra can be divided into 9 by 9 cells or magic squares in which each number corresponds to a Kannada phoneme. A cipher was published in the recent scholarly books, a sequence of well-defined steps. For instance, you always start with the middle number of the first line, 3 here. I guess you see it best there, 3 in the middle of the top line, and then follow a strict sequence common now to recreational mathematics for linking phonemes into words and into sentences. In this, the top left cell of the large chakra, the deciphered sequence produces the Kannada phonemes that construct the sentence. And excuse, my wife speaks Kannada, but I don't. Am baredihe guru verisenya samatadim ganasi aravat Sapta Akshara Samyoga Vimala Bangan Karuvar, which might be translated into English. I have written, with Guru Vairasina's approval, this observation of the union of 64 letters. That's as far as I got in my translation. There is no punctuation, and the last two words, the name Vimala Bangan Karuvar, are the subject of the next sentence. I can't say whether the Siri Bouvelaya contains everything that its champions claim for it, hundreds of languages and hundreds of works of literature, all composed into a fantastically inventive numerical code. Yet, even without empirical corroboration, isn't human experience, with all that constitutes it, incomplete without the Siri Bouvelaya? The poem says to us, here is everything, from the past into the future. Take what you want, what you don't already have, in whatever language you like, from this infinite cosmos of a poet's imagination. For me, the Siri Bouvelaya needs no further authentication to be marvelously what it is. Okay, now I'm going to shift to South America. The language of the South American Aymara interests me in particular because I've co-translated two books by the Bolivian visionary poet Jaime Sáenz, whose work is notably influenced by Aymara language and culture. The Aymara come from an ancient temple-building people. Their history predates the Incas by 500 years, and their empire has outlasted it for nearly as long. Today, the Aymara comprise a quarter of Bolivia's population, and they reside mainly in the country's oxygen-thin western highlands. According to cognitive scientist Rafael Nunez at University of California, San Diego, in Aymara, it's impossible to say something like, in May of 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the cross in Rouen, France. It's impossible to construct a sentence like that, since every sentence that the Aymara speak has to be qualified by whether, since that statement is unqualified by anyone's experience, and because every sentence in Aymara has to express whether an action or an event was personally witnessed or not. For the Aymara, the past is linguistically and conceptually in front of the people, while the future lies behind them. To speak of the future, elderly Aymara will thumb or wave backwards over their shoulder. To reference the past, they'll make forward sweeping motions with their hands and arms. Nunez notes that the main word for eye, front, and sight in Aymara means the past, while the basic word for back or behind also means the future. It's been suggested that in a culture that places a premium on stipulating degrees of evidential investment, distinguishing the observed from the unobserved, the known from the unknown, it makes sense to metaphorically position the past in your field of vision, while the future, which is always speculative, remains invisible behind you. In this case, and others, like the widely publicized research by Daniel Everett on the cultural constraints in grammar and cognition on the Paraha, a people in the Amazonian basin, there seems to be a close relation between the particularities of language and the perceptions and conceptions of the speakers of that language. Here's the Bolivian poet Jaime Sáenz, who I co-translated two books of, and who was still the most important Bolivian poet of the 20th century and the most influential. I spent a lot of time in Bolivia tracking down places where he went. For interesting, this is just a street scene in La Paz. La Paz is full of shamanic activity. You'll see people in alleys melting lead and pouring lead into a bucket of water to read the future for someone who's just paid them to do that. Every official building in La Paz is built over the fetus of a llama because that protects the building. It's a very mystical place, and that mysticism comes from the Aymara, and that mysticism is a main feature of Jaime Saen's work. Here's Jaime Saen's channeling Aymara spiritual regard for the harmony of opposites into a poetic philosophical grammar. So this is the translation from a book called The Night, La Noche. For there is a mandate you must obey in tribute to the night's truth, which is your truth, even if at the cost of impossible sacrifices and endless torments. You must say goodbye and retreat into the space of your body, and so you must, regardless of the mockery and contempt of a kind and rational world. Note that thousands on thousands of mortals slip effortlessly into the respective spaces of their bodies, day after day, like it or not, to the clamor of refulgent trumpets at the center of weeping and wailing, because, truth told, to retreat into the space of the body is to die. But here, we're not talking about dying. Here, we're talking about obeying the mandate, and for that it shall be necessary to live. And this is so real that the mandate can't be obeyed but by retreating into the space of the body with the sole purpose of living. It's certain those who risk such a rare thing disguise themselves from death, only to glimpse there death's raison d'etre. What is the night, you ask now and forever? The night, a revelation still veiled, perhaps a death form, tenacious, flexed, perhaps a body lost to the night itself, truly a chasm, a space unimaginable, a subtle, lightless realm, not unlike the body dwelling in you, which hides, surely, many clues to the night. One time, I came close to my body, and realizing I had never seen it, even though I bore it with me, I asked it who it was. And a voice in the silence said to me, I am the body who inhabits you, and I am here in the darkness, and I suffer you, and I live you and die you. But I am not your body. I am the night. Jaime Saen's hardly ever left the city of La Paz, and he spent his time drinking with Aymara, who believe that the membrane between death and life is permeable and that people can pass back and forth across it. That's Jaime Saen's channeling the Aymara, but still writing in Spanish. Now, how would you begin to translate even a word in a language so dependent on testament and completely fused with a conception of time and death that is not only alien to Western conceptions, but inverted? Last poet I'm going to talk about. Gozo Yoshimatsu is one of Japan's most influential contemporary poets. His poems often explore, like Matsuo Basho's, moments in journeys that are at once physical and spiritual. Hence his trips to Hiroshima, to Namie, where a nuclear power plant meltdown contaminated the landscapes, and to Rikuzentakata, where a tsunami permanently dislocated 20,000 people and demolished every structure. As part of an ethical inclusiveness, he scrupulously cites the names of others with whom he shares conversations. Characteristically, he ceremonializes those references in his poems by citing dates and place names. In Kasumi, with Sato Masayoshi-san, last year of the rat, December 2009 to 31st, at 3 o'clock, just at year's end. He refers to friends and strangers and long-dead writers with tender reverence. The Syrian poet Adonis is that great poet of Damascus. The Japanese filmmaker is that dear Ozu Yasushiro. Even a puppy is honored as his dogship. Gozo goes so far in his honorifics as to curiously dedicate someone else's poem, Hoshi Sagyo's 12th century Furrowed Road to Embers, to a contemporary poet that he admires. It is critical for him to credit the words of others. Partly, he says, he does this out of shyness. He readily yields his own voice in order to allow for other voices, which I think is the act of translation. And so his poems are consistently polyvocal. Many poems are addressed to marginalized people, the Ainu of Japan, for instance, and to signal sites of presence and absence, to places from which people have disappeared. He goes to such sites and sets out recording equipment, his camera with its warped lens, a tape recorder, and in these empty places on barren, radioactive beaches, he spreads out these things and listens and watches for signs of presence. Much of Gozo's writing, along with his films, which he calls Gozo Cine, comprise the record of a never-ending conversation with the dead. As though for Gozo, all language, but especially poetry, is memorial. Since the 3/11 disaster in Japan, that complex of catastrophes, the earthquake, the tsunami, the radiation leak that caused more than 20,000 deaths and forced the evacuation of close to 300,000 people, Gozo has felt called to quote-unquote live as a poet. What this means for him is to cultivate a constant vulnerability, an ongoing receptiveness. It's an ethical stance. Gozo often breaks down Japanese into phonemes, progressions and rhymes, counterpointed sonic progressions. Often he'll include fragments of English, French, Chinese, Okinawan, or Korean. And on paper, he uses multiple scripts, Romanji, Korean Hangul, and invented Maniogana, pictographs, as well as normal Japanese kanji characters. This is relatively unusual in contemporary Japanese, which uses kanji in order to represent meaning rather than phonetics. For instance, the sound o is sometimes written with the character meaning rabbit, and sometimes with the character signifying universe, thus introducing another dimension of meaning from the physical appearance and the sound qualities. He's making rhymes and connections that simply cannot happen in English because we have a different kind of script. Gozo also uses an invented tear-shaped character that represents the cessation of sound. Altogether, his scripts function a bit like stacked chords in a musical composition, creating harmonic complexes through which 3 or more melodic lines can be tracked. What's missing from Gozo Yoshimasu's poetry on the page, as you can see, is about anything that resembles conventional poetry. Gozo's work sprawls, expanding and contracting like the universe, with side notes, multiple voices, repetitions, parentheses, super and minor scripts, with ruby, those small annotations that appear above base characters to indicate pronunciation, and quotations, often from writers like Melville, Dickinson, Emerson. Gozo's poems take on a Talmudic density. His focus on the letters and characters that make up words, and his penchant for elaborate visual and oral rhymes, literary references, and narrative sketches might even seem, to the Western reader, Kabbalistic. Undoubtedly, Gozo Yoshimatsu is one of the most distinct and innovative poets of our time. It's been said that his poems are untranslatable. But all poems are untranslatable until the right translator shows up. Translation, in its many senses, is a constant theme in Gozo's writing because his work generates so many different reading experiences. So I think maybe the best way to share his poems with an English reading public could be through multiple translators, each approaching from a different angle. This would be in keeping with Gozo's own polyvocality and with the open-endedness of his body of work. That's the approach I took in editing and translating for the book Alice, Iris, Red Horse, the poems of Gozo Yoshimatsu. Some readers may question, I'm at the end, some readers may question whether such innovative translations represent the original. But I wonder if the goal of representing the original is really the goal of translation at all, given that the original work is necessarily subjected to alteration, transformation, dislocation, and displacement. And given that transformation and displacement are major concerns in Gozo's work, maybe there are times when not representing the original is precisely what permits the creation of something less definitive but more ongoing, a form of translation that amplifies and renews the suppleness of the original poetry's meanings, much like Jen Bervin's installation translation of Hulsey's poem. That might bring us back to Bervin's artistic response to Suhui's palindromic poem at Catherine Clark Gallery. Maybe, particularly for so-called untranslatable works of the kinds I've mentioned, Suhui's Infinite Palindrome, the Siri Bouvalea, or the poems of Gozo Yoshimatsu, the original ceases to function as any kind of definitive representation. And the question, can it be translated, becomes like the question a Buddhist monk asks the priest Joshu, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Joshu answers, mu, which is taken to mean that the question is too small for the answer. Translation might be considered a frequently borrowed divine apparatus, a warped and leaky alembic for the transference of energy, rhythm, language, and imagination. Its elaborate theories are compelling as ideas. Note that Benjamin's translations, though, of Baudelaire's Parisian tableau are utterly ordinary and don't take part at all in his radical translation theory, because theories, finally, are not of much practical use. After all is said and done, translation is more of a spiritual than a transcriptural activity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Forrest. I am full of thoughts, like connecting the earlier speakers with this talk too. They blended together so interestingly. Questions? Do we have questions for Forrest? Okay. Get my exercise. Do you want to respond from up here? Is that okay? Because I know some people can't hear as well, so.
It's just a little thought that apparently you speak many of these languages to be able to translate them. Do you find when you're speaking, say in Spanish or in Japanese or whatever, Italian, that your body motions and your gestures change completely? I mean, start speaking Italian, I start going like this. So, as soon as you start speaking another language, you take on the body language.
It's true. I think, language, even though I love the word on the page, and my writing is basically for the page, the language comes out of our bodies, and it always has. And even when we read to ourselves, scientists say that our larynx is moving up and down, that our body is responding to the particularity of the words. And the miracle of other languages and the horror of English displacing so many is that each language seems not only connected to perhaps a way of perceiving the world, but a way of expressing the world. There's a fantastic essay by Mary Austin, who lived in California for a long time and who studied Native Americans, and who came to feel that that place influences the rhythms of a language. And she says, for example, that if you listen carefully to the Gettysburg Address, what you hear are the rhythms of a man who spent a lot of time chopping wood. And here's a Japanese poem, an old Japanese poem from the Manyoshu attributed to Semimaru. And you'll hear the 5-7-5-7-7 syllabic pattern. But the poem semantically is almost meaningless. What we would read is, this is it, coming and going, the unknown and the knowing at the barrier wall of Osaka. Like, what? But the audience would have known that the barrier wall of Osaka, and this is a different Osaka than the Osaka now, was the place where the men would leave on journeys for months and leave their families, and the families would come to the barrier wall and wave goodbye, and so people were coming and going, and it was a place of grief and joy. But all of that is communicated not in the semantics, but in the rhythms of the poem. Here it is. Kore ya kono, yuku mo, kaeru mo, wakarete wa, shiru mo, shiranu mo, Osaka no seki. A short one at the end. But in the old days, this Osaka had a double O sound. So it was Osaka. And let me do it together. Or just recite the whole thing. Listen to what vowel comes out the most. Kure ya kono, yuku mo, kaeru mo, wakarete wa, shiru mo, shiranu mo, Osaka no seki. Oh, you hear that? Oh. And remember what I told you about Reuven Sur saying that those deep O and U sounds are connected with deeper feelings. So it's the grief of leaving, of departing, is all in the sound of the poem, and then doubly emphasized because of that double O at the end. And then you also hear the going and coming, that rhythm, yuku mo, kaeru mo. So the whole meaning of the poem is acted out in the sound of the poem, and the sound of the poem comes from a body. And I think it does, Susan, you have another language too, right? Indonesian. And does your body language change there? As soon as I get on the plane. In anticipation.
Well, I hear it, and then my mind would kind of like
yeah.
turn on to another page.
Yeah. Are there any other questions before we hand out the drugs?
We don't have time for many more, but there was one over here first, and I think it was Mary.
Thank you for your presentation. Wonderful. You give the sense of translation as an act of bridging. And so many times in these days, there's a timidity about appropriation, where I think instead of building walls, you want to build bridges and talk about translation as that act of transposition, and that it's not taking from something, but it's giving to something. I wonder if you can speak to that.
That is how I think of it. And I think if someone doesn't want to be translated, and there are some poets that don't, that we shouldn't, or some writers that don't, but for me, it's the celebration of another way of seeing the world and experiencing the world, rhythmically and with an image repertoire, and that the spiritual quality of translation is that to be a good translator, you have to disappear. Your ego has to disappear. Even the way that you write has to disappear so that you can hear your way into someone else's mind. And that's a spiritual act. And I think that's the a priori act of translation is a kind of humility before the work in front of you. And that's a kind of gift.
Okay, one final question.
You speak about translating for the page, and I'm wondering if you are able to find the typefaces that communicate all the voices that you wish to appear on the page.
That's so great question, and I wish my press paid more attention to that. There was a wonderful guy in ethnomusicology at Brown University when I taught there who interviewed lots of blues writers, and his interviews were typographically fabulous because he would indicate where their voice got larger or smaller, or where they shouted with different typology, different typefaces, and I thought that was fabulous. But many presses are too conservative to do that. But of course, that's a form of expression that can add detail to communication, to how we take language in from the page. You and I should work together. Let's talk. Thank you so much.